All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first in the monthly series for this year, 2025, in which we're going to talk about the DMBOK and talk about chapters 1 and 2 specifically in preparation for the CDMP exams. So hopefully during the session, you'll get some tips out of what to zero your focus in on with regards to being prepared for the CDMP. If you've joined us in the past, we're going to do something a little bit different this year. We're going to provide some key focus on a couple of sections within each of the chapters. So instead of going through the chapters for key point by keywords, we're going to take a critical eye on a couple of main sections of each of the chapters. As I mentioned, today we're talking about chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 is data management. Chapter 2 is all about data ethics. CDMP question breakdown. So the official guidance with regards to how the CDMP is structured, 60% of the content comes directly from the DMBOK, 20% are familiar concepts, and 20% are multidisciplinary or practical type of concepts. Now, our informal guidance based on experience, so this is more anecdotal evidence, 80% of the content really comes from the DMBOK. They really focus on elements of the DMBOK. 10% are familiar concepts, and another 10% are practical type of concepts. So what you might experience in your shops. That's been our experience with regards to how the questions break down inside the CDMP exam. And of course, there was an update last year. The second edition had a revised edition that was published. They began pushing the exam out the door in November of last year using the revised edition. So if you already have the older second edition, you don't necessarily have to buy the revised edition. We've put a QR code up here. There's a blog post on Data Strategy Professionals that will explain the differences between the editions. So you can probably base whether you really want to buy that revised edition or not. If you've already gotten and bought the revised edition, you're perfectly aligned for how the exam is structured today. So let's go into chapter 1. Chapter 1 is the data management chapter, and we're going to talk about some of the concepts. We're going to zero in on the data management frameworks that's listed inside of this chapter. Before I talk about those data management frameworks, I just want to highlight one thing for you, and that is the data management principles that are mentioned in this chapter. So section 2.4 in this chapter talks about the data management principles. You might want to highlight those. There's a number of bullet points in that section. I went and tagged that within my book before I took the exam. If you're taking the exam using the physical book, it's okay to have your book with sticky notes. So you can see I've got sticky notes tab throughout my book. I put a sticky note tab here for data management principles. If you're using the e-version of the book, you can go ahead and just annotate inside that e-version. And I would just highlight this particular section on data management principles. There could be some questions that come up regarding those principles in particular. And you just want to highlight some of the bullet points as you read through this. It also has a really cool illustration within this section that talks about the data management principles, and it breaks them out. So it's nice and neat, a quick, easy visual reference for you as well. So I highlighted that, and I just wanted to bring that up before I got into the content that we're going to talk about today. So the next pieces to highlight as we focus in on something in chapter 1, which is the data management frameworks. So this is section 3. At the very top of this section highlights what are these data management frameworks, how are they defined. The very first data management framework that's highlighted in this section is the strategic alignment model. So this is section 3.1. The strategic alignment model, Henderson and Venkatarama, 1999, abstracts the fundamental drivers for any approach to data management. So this particular model has been around for a little while. It arranges it by subject areas. At its center is the relationship between data and information. I highlighted just the first 2 sentences to tell me what this model is about. I like the visual reference too, so you can just have that visual cue in your head. This is what the strategic alignment model looks like. There could be a question on these particular frameworks. I'm not going to zero in on those questions. I'm going to zero in on the definition of the framework itself. So the framework, strategic alignment model, Henderson and Venkataraman, is just a key one. I would just highlight those first 2 sentences. The fully articulated strategic alignment model is more complex than is illustrated here. This is just a high-level conceptual view of it. Then we come to section 3.2, which is the Amsterdam information model. I'm not going to try and say their names. Obviously, they're Dutch names, which is fine. This was around since 1997. This model, like the strategic alignment model, takes a strategic perspective on the business and IT alignment. It's also known as the 9-cell model. So that's the first couple of sentences for this section. I would highlight those. That gives you a quick reference for the definition. The creators of both of these models describe in detail the relationship between the components, both from a horizontal, which is the business IT strategy, and vertical, which is the business strategy and business operations perspective. So it gives you a matrix view of how you approach data management in its concepts. And again, it aligns the business with the strategy. It gives you tactics and operations, and then it aligns those cells within the matrix itself as to what the subject areas are that you're going to dive into. So just as a framework, it's a way of organizing your data management operations and organization. This could be a question on the test. This is also known as the 9-cell model. So they might reference that on the test saying, what is known as the 9-cell model? You know the right answer is the Amsterdam Information Model, AIM. The next section, 3.3, is the DAMA DMBOK framework. The DAMA DMBOK framework goes into more depth about the knowledge areas that make up the overall scope of data management per sentence. We've got the DAMA wheel. We've got the knowledge area context diagram. We have the environmental factors hexagon, which I have presented here. The DAMA environmental factors hexagon shows the relationship between people, processes, and technology, and provides a key for reading the DMBOK context diagrams. So you'll see at the beginning of each chapter, and it's summarized here in chapter 1. Chapter 1 helps set up all the future chapters throughout the book. There's a generic context diagram that is also shown in this section, 3.3. This environmental factors hexagon provides a key in a visual manner of how to read the generic context diagram. These particular subject areas are arranged on the context diagram, and then they give you specific points to highlight from that chapter within the context diagram that begins each chapter. This hexagon gives you a nice visual reference on how those subject areas are organized around the goals and principles that are associated with that subject area. So for instance, if we're talking about data quality, the data quality context diagram will have listed at its top a definition, and then the goals and principles are right underneath it. Then it'll get into the inputs, the activities, the deliverables, the techniques, tools, and metrics will be what's at the bottom. And then throughout the chapter, they'll talk about the people. So it's a good visual reference for how you might leverage the environmental factors hexagon. And of course, then there's the DAMA wheel. This will become a familiar part of each chapter as well. The DAMA wheel, it places data governance at the center of the data management activities, since governance is required for consistency within and balance between the functions. So they put at the heart of this data governance. Data governance is talked about in chapter 3. It has around those pieces data quality, data architecture. So each of these actually result in being chapters throughout the book. And then it's also a very good visual reference. I've used this in consulting practices as well, where you can have one of these pie slices highlighted out if you wanted to emphasize that as you're doing a presentation. Maybe you want to educate senior leadership on the importance of metadata, or you want to talk about data security in particular and do a deep dive on that, then you could use this wheel as the setup for that presentation and then pop that section out to give it a little emphasis on where you are with regards to data management as a practice. I found the DAMA wheel very handy to use in practice. I haven't used the hexagon as much, but I have found that the hexagon is useful if you want a visual reference on how each of the chapters is organized around these subject areas. And then there's the next section, which is 3.4, the DMBOK pyramid. The Aiken pyramid is also called. It was developed by Peter Aiken, one of the fellows and authors for this book. So it is organized and it uses the DMBOK functional areas to show the relation and interdependencies between the knowledge areas. So it's got the same knowledge areas that you saw on the DAMA wheel, but it's organized in a triangular fashion. Inside the book itself, 3.4 describes the phases in which each of these sections of the triangle come into being. Right? So certain phases are more foundational or technical in nature. Some phases are more process in nature. So each of those phases, 1, 2, 3, and 4, this also could be a good test question. They may reference the Aiken pyramid as a test question. They most likely would not mention one of the phases, but it's good to highlight maybe the first sentence for each phase, so you have a quick visual reference to get to that definition. And then also just the definition of the Aiken pyramid itself. We have found that using the Aiken pyramid to denote where you are in the data management practice per chapter, it explains to you if it's foundational in nature, if it's technical or integral in gluing pieces from the process to use, and then high use with regards to data science being at the very top. Very handy in being able to denote that. And then the next section, 3.5, it's titled DAMA Data Management Framework Evolve. So this is a different take on those knowledge areas. It's developed by Sue Gwens, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name exactly correctly, but I think I'm fairly close. This framework recognizes that business intelligence and analytic functions have dependencies on all other data management functions. and it organizes them just slightly differently than what you might have seen on the DAMA wheel or in Aiken's pyramid. So it gives more of a functional summary view for each of those subject areas that are related to data management as a practice. These are two different figures within this section. We've got this figure and we have the second figure, which is more practical in its implementation. So if you're going to go ahead and use this one, it helps you align data architecture with some of the concepts. Maybe you want to align data governance and then highlight certain features within the data management practice that it's going to govern. These are very handy references to be able to use that. So it evolves from the DAMA wheel, which is simple and surrounded by data governance. It breaks it down into more subject areas and functional areas to focus in on by practice. And then lastly, we've got section 4, where we're talking about DAMA and the DMBOK. This is the DAMA wheel evolves, so it combines some of the features that you saw in the frameworks. We have a triangle in the middle. That is not the Aiken's pyramid. You will notice that the wording is very different. However, data governance is very prominent in its feature at the top of this wheel. It has a number of the subject areas related to data governance in the wheel itself. And then in the triangle, you've got a lot of the functional pieces that compose data management as a practice. This particular section, section 4, dives into and summarizes a number of the elements that you're going to see throughout the book. So the reason for the wheel is it gives you a nice visual representation. I'm not saying that you would have any type of test questions that could come up with regards to this wheel. You could have a question that comes up with something about the knowledge areas, and the knowledge areas are summarized. You will see about 3 or 4 paragraphs into the section where they talk about each of the knowledge areas. And each of these knowledge areas then become a chapter later on. And this section, section 4, is actually the end of this particular chapter. The test itself doesn't have a lot of questions around data management. So chapter 1 will show you what to expect. There's not a lot of heavy emphasis on the frameworks. I wouldn't get hung up on each of them or what they're named. I wouldn't try and memorize them. I would just tag it in your book with a sticky or an annotation. Say, this is how I get a quick reference to go check them out if I need a definition. All right, data ethics, chapter 2. So this one also is lightly handled on the test, only 2%, even though this is a pretty weighty topic, very important topic. If you ignore it, regulators will come down on you hard if you miss something. So what we're going to focus in on with regards to this chapter are some of those principles that are out there. So GDPR, PIPEDA, those type of things. I would just highlight in the introduction, there's a sentence that tells you about it. Data handling ethics are concerned with how to procure, store, manage, use, and dispose of data in ways that are aligned with ethical principles. So they have the data lifecycle outlined as part of that sentence. This is the third sentence on the first section. I would just highlight that because that pretty much gives you an easy answer that could show up as a question on the test. So foundations of data ethics, the Belmont report. This is how we start off the chapter. 3.1 ethical principles for data is where you find this. They have these bullet points listed out there. So the Belmont principles, respect for persons, beneficence, justice. So those definitely could become a question on the test. They may ask you about one of the principles. It's good to highlight those bullet points, highlight the definitions of the principles. They are very important to how you describe data ethics. The Belmont report could also be a trivia fact that they could pop onto the test for you as well. So this section, 3.1, it's worth the read. You can read the whole section. Very beneficial to understand. The European Data Protection Supervisor. This is a person, but this role set out an opinion for digital ethics, specifically focused on big data. There are 4 bullet points that are listed in this section, which you can go ahead and read those. The sentence that follows those bullet points is something that I highlighted. That's these principles map broadly to the principles set out in the Belmont report, focusing on promoting human dignity and autonomy. The EDPS states that privacy is a fundamental human right. So I highlighted that sentence, which follows those 4 bullet points in this section, only because that screams to me as a good question that could pop on the test. So as we look at the data privacy legislation globally, this has been evolving. This is a rudimentary timeline that we put together. Canada put out the PIPEDA around 2000. It's of course been evolving since, but the basic premises will remain the same. 2012, the Federal Trade Commission here in the US put out some criteria for privacy programs. That is not to say that is set in stone, because if you're in the United States, each of the 50 states have their own privacy advocacies or privacy regulations. So it makes the United States a little unique in that and difficult to manage too, because you got to be aware of 50 different principles. European Union, they've followed the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which was an evolution out of Safe Harbor. If anyone remembers Safe Harbor before GDPR, Safe Harbor actually originated out of Germany. GDPR is the European mechanisms for managing privacy regulation. 2016 is when it started to come about, but 2018 is when it went into effect. So if you're in the data management practice, you'll want to focus on what is coming out, what is being shaped, because you're going to have to start putting code or policy behind it before it becomes into effect. If you waited until 2018 to implement GDPR policies, you're probably too late because the regulators will get you. So in 2018, you got the GDPR takes effect in the United States. The California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, that went into effect loosely based on a lot of principles that you would find in the GDPR. And then that's also another gold standard within the US. A lot of US states followed California's model. They would actually state as part of their privacy policy, if it's in the CCPA, then we also have it. So as that evolves, that keeps it simple for them. And in 2023, here in the US, a number of other states started to enact their own privacy policy laws. If we're in the chapter itself, they don't go in the timeline fashion like this. So in the book itself, section 3.2, you've got the principles of GDPR. And the very first table within this section, the OECD Principles General Data Protection Regulation of the EU, also known as GDPR. I highlighted that because the test also likes to explode acronyms. So they may pop a question out there to have you define what the acronym is. So they may look to you to explode out GDPR, and they'll give you variants. General Data Protection Regulation is the right answer, but they might switch the word protection for something else or regulation for something else. So you got to pay attention to what the answers are so that you can pick the right answer for what GDPR stands for. And then the principles are in the table. So having quick access to the table is also good to be able to validate a question with regards to these principles. Depending on your particular role within a company determines whether or not you need to memorize this table or if you just need access to this table to be able to talk about the description of the principle purpose limitation. In the description here in the book, personal data must be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes and not processed in a manner that is incompatible with these purposes. You could see that as a question on the test. They may list the description and then have you identify which principle that is. And this is true for any of the tables that I'll be showing you or talking about. So in that case, the question would list out the description, and I would have to then go and understand, oh, that's purpose limitation. That's that principle they're talking about. Now, if you have that memorized, you'll know that right away. But if not, you can access this table, compare the definition with the question, and then pick out the right principle. As a test taking tip, you go through the questions, flag the ones that you may want to go back and validate. Don't try and validate it at the time that you're reading and doing the question, unless it's right at your fingertips. Speed is of the essence when you're taking the test. Sometimes it's just better to flag that question and say, I'm going to come back to it and say, I've checked the table on that. So the other part of GDPR that's important to note, and this is the last sentence of the paragraph that follows the table. The GDPR requires effective governance and documentation to enable and demonstrate compliance and mandate privacy by design. So I highlight privacy by design as a key factor for how GDPR is governed. So you need to factor that in. Privacy by design is a keyword. All right, the next one, this one was developed earlier, but it has been evolving. So it's the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act from Canada, PIPEDA. I always say out PIPEDA. I'm sure there's a way to say the acronym in a more fun fashion, but that's how I say it. Again, I highlight the table. The principles here are summarized on the screen. Again, a question could come up specific to Canadian PIPEDA in which you need to identify the principle, or they most likely will want you to explode the acronym. So what does PIPEDA stand for? And then you'll have to pick it out. Again, you'd have to pay attention to what they put in those radio buttons because they'll probably switch up a couple of the words. The next table is from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. These are guidelines. So the Federal Trade Commission realized from a global perspective around consumer data protections that guidelines were necessary. Now, it was up to the states individually to put out their own privacy regulations, which they had already started down that path, just following in the footsteps of what Canada was doing, what Safe Harbor was doing over in Europe, the rumblings that we were hearing out of Asia at the time. So the Federal Trade Commission put together these guidelines to help the states be aware of what they should put into their particular principles. Again, this table gives you the principle and it gives you the description of the principle. It's an interesting topic becomes a little muddled because of the 50 states and the way they go about doing things on their own. So California took the most stringent approach, and the CCPA came out paying attention to these guidelines and principles and gave some weight to those principles themselves. And then subsequent states, which have caught up to California at this point, are starting to put out their own, mimicking what California or the GDPR has already stated. So if you had already programmed your particular application or data management suites based on GDPR compliance or CCPA compliance, then you're already ahead of the game. And that allows you the ability to be flexible. How much different is it from CCPA? Do I need to accommodate for that? Especially if I'm doing e-commerce business as an example, which is everywhere. I don't know if you can restrict if someone from Europe is trying to order off a US site. Maybe you don't ship to Europe. That's fine. But if you're in the United States, you're going to have to pay attention to all 50 states regulations to be compliant, especially if you're a retailer. They may not get audited as much, but your own internal audits should be able to show that you're compliant with all the regulations across the 50 states. So those are the deep dives on those principles. Within my book, I've got that tag with its own little sticky so I can quickly access those tables. If I get a question, they're most likely going to give you the description and you have to pick out what the principle is. In some cases, I could see it being flipped, but most of the time I would expect that you would see the description and have to pick out the name of the principle. But having quick access to these tables so you can quickly validate your answer is definitely the way to go. I highlighted a few other things in the chapter that you might want to take a look at. It's not a long chapter. I really would just focus in on the introduction about the Belmont principles and these particular tables. I would also take time to read the section on bias, 3.4.4. That's a very good section to read up on, especially important in today's era of AI and large language models. So you hear a lot of talk about bias. That section might be a little bit dated, but it's focused on data. So it's a good section to read if you want to go ahead and read that particular section. All right, moving forward a little bit with regards to test expectations, test tips and tricks. So one of the things that we talk about at Data Strategy Professionals as we're providing education around the CDMP is go ahead and walk yourself through the test completely. Do all the questions. And then as you're doing the test, make note of certain questions that may have tripped you up or you feel that need additional validation, and you can circle back to those questions. So from a standardized test perspective, it's always good to just float all the way through the questions. Don't spend a lot of time getting stuck. If you find yourself spending more than 30, 45 seconds on a question, flag that and come back. If you can get through all of the questions, that allows you some time. Maybe you've got 15, 20 minutes towards the end of the time period in which you can then circle back and then do some lookups to validate as you go through. That seems to be a recipe for success. You don't want to leave questions blank, and you don't want to get to the end of the test and run out of time just because you spent time leafing through the book, doing Control F on your PDF, getting stuck on particular questions. Better to save some of that time for the end. Okay, what to expect on the exams. So chapter 1, which was the data management principles, similar things to expect, like we talked about, data management principles, tag that section. That section is a good one to keep as a reference. The data lifecycle, that's a section in there as well, section 2.5.9. So there could be a question on that. This is a low weighted chapter. So the data lifecycle could be interesting. Maybe they might ask a question on that. The benefits and risks associated with data. It's a setup for later chapters. 2.5.11 talks about data and risk. So you'll see that mentioned again in chapters like the security or big data, data warehousing. They talk about some of the risks associated with the data, data modeling, and data architecture. You may also find mentions about risks associated with the data. But in this particular chapter, this is a good summary and a setup for the others. And it gives you also those benefits. And then the data management frameworks. So each of those frameworks that we highlighted, good to have a little reference point for those as well. Before I move on to the next slide, does anyone actually employ the use of any of these frameworks in their current day jobs? Do you want to identify which one?
The JRP. I'm from the Netherlands, so of course it's used.
You probably pronounce those names better than me.
Yeah, everything was good. Everything was correct. Nothing wrong.
No, that's good. It's encouraging to hear that the models are used. Like I said, in my consulting days, I did the use of the DAMA wheel. I found that since the simplicity of the DAMA wheel, it was a way to educate senior leaders on what section we're talking about from a data management practice. Also, for the teams within your data architecture group, where do they land within the whole landscape of data management? And how do they relate to the other pieces? And the Aiken pyramid, I also found very useful to help people understand what's foundational versus integration versus use, and explaining that to senior leaders. They like diagrams. So using the diagram to pop those things out, and then you can animate those diagrams in your presentation. Now that's cool. I didn't think that anyone was still using the AIM or the Amsterdam model or the other model. That was cool.
No, they do, and they discuss because now we are at the process of merging two companies and again reinstalling all of this, the whole data governance and data structure. So this is indeed used. They're actually asked from us. That's why I'm taking the exam, that we really get the knowledge on that.
Wonderful. That's awesome. Yeah, from a mergers and acquisitions perspective, when you're merging a couple of companies together, these frameworks are key, just as you mentioned. Even using the knowledge function areas, using that diagram, which gives you a little deeper dive on some of those function areas, is really key to be able to identify where do we have overlap as we're merging these companies? How do we resolve some of those overlaps? And how are these companies doing their data architectures differently? Then you can get into some of those technical components within the architecture and say, okay, now how do we resolve these conflicts? Maybe we're using two different tools to do the same thing. And also licensing conversations too. You want to not overlap and spend licenses for two different tools doing the same thing.
Exactly. But also, I would like to underline that changing the culture, understanding what kind of role the data plays. For now, we're facing this the most because the tendency was before like, okay, it's something which comes the last. Mostly it's just practically move this data from this system to this system. And no one thought about it from the beginning. So then you face lots of challenges and data team is facing all those challenges and in the end, maybe failing at some point. And others not taking responsibility on that. As if it doesn't come from the management, it's really hard going down up.
Right. Yeah. Something else that you may find as you go through the book and prepare yourself for the exam is the importance of assessment and the education that you can provide going upstream to senior management on the necessity of some of these assessments. And data profiling is part of that exercise so that, again, you can educate your senior leadership on some of the important factors around this data before they say, hey, why is the data management team taking so long? Just move the data from A to B. No, there's more to it. Definitely. I agree. A good call out on the culture piece. So also that comes up very heavily in data ethics. You'll see that mentioned throughout the data ethics chapter about culture. And also from a global perspective, if it's a global company, how things are enacted in the US are different from how they may be acted in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. They also have different cultural factors to consider as well as to what is considered consent or opted in, especially when you're dealing with consumer data. Manufacturing data is easier in that concept because you don't need consent. You just need facts. And everybody can agree on standards around some of those manufacturing facts. Well, thank you, Olga. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to the next one. So chapter 2, what to expect on the exam. Of course, the Belmont principles, as I highlighted, GDPR origins and principles. That table is key. However, we did talk about some of those other principled laws that you have to be aware of. So don't be surprised if the Canadian one pops up on the exam. GDPR is probably the more prominent, but the Canada one will probably come up. Data handling risks. So if you want to read through the section 3.4, risks of unethical data handling practices, that might be also the section where it mentions bias. And then establishing an ethical data culture is 3.5. So again, a way to provide some educational content if you're talking about things with senior leadership. As far as the exam goes, there could be a question with regards to ethical data culture. Most likely, I would see questions around the Belmont principles and the GDPR principles or those privacy principles from a global perspective. So this is just to give you those clues. There's a couple of other sections that might have some significant keywords for you to key in. Was there any questions with regards to these particular chapters in relation to the CDMP exam? Did you get what you were looking for today? Some quick tips, maybe a little bit of focus on those sections.
All right, John, just a quick question. Sorry, I missed that Belmont principles. So which section was that? I'm looking it up. I couldn't see a set of principles that
Right. If you go to section 3.1 in chapter 2, there's 3 bullet points. It's separated by paragraphs. Each of those bullet points are one of these principles.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then highlight those definitions because most likely you would see the definition is the question and they want you to identify what that principle is. So they might say this principle has 2 elements, do no maximize possible benefit. And you know that's beneficial.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Good question.
John, one of the practitioners asked this really all-encompassing question, but I did want to read it to see if you had any suggestions. So in AJ asks, what are the tips to thrive in the data management profession? Certification is one thing. What practical hands-on experience is required for data management, specifically data management consultancy?
Yeah, well, a cliche term would be trial and error. Certification does give you the foundation education. So reading some of these materials like the DMBOK, there's other books out there, of course, but working in a data architecture practice, maybe starting out as a data modeler really gives you a good entry point because you're forced to ask questions. So you become a really good interviewer when you become a data modeler. And the data modeling is not tool specific. There are tools out there to help you do the models, of course, but data modeling in itself, you're really talking about what are the data aspects that support a particular process within a company. Data modeling within consulting is tricky because a lot of companies just hire them directly for their own staff. But data modeling does offer you a great entry point. Data repository administration is another good one. You get to learn all aspects around it. If you're a data repository administration, then you delve more about the infrastructure as well. If you're a data modeler, you can also choose a path that takes you down database administration. They're intertwined. A database administrator is another good entry point, but sometimes they can be very siloed and specific to a particular technology. So you might be an IBM, Oracle, maybe just a particular, or Microsoft SQL Server. You become specific to a particular database. That's not to say database administrators can't take on more than one technology, but typically they are specific to one or two technologies. While the data architects, they are not. They're specific more to what data supports a particular business process. So I found that that's a path to success. So a business analyst or working in a data governance group also gives you a broad perspective across a particular company as to how you might use data, how you might capture data. I've also found, interestingly enough, if you work in a marketing type of environment, marketers are very, very, very hungry for data. They're not very specific sometimes about their data. So that was where you put on your data modeling hat and ask questions. Why do I need to capture that particular data? Also being aware of privacy principles so that you can guide particular use of data. Those are things that come across as you're working in data modeling or in data architecture. So hopefully that helps you understand how to thrive in it. When I say trial and error as well, you've got to be not afraid of failing with regards to getting your data model correct. There's a lot of iteration that goes with data modeling. So you ask a lot of questions, try to understand the process, try to understand the usage, try to understand what data that they're trying to gather or capture, whether it's a manufacturing process, a financial process, or a customer consumer related process. Supply chain also has a lot of questions to ask too, to make sure that you have the right data that is going to lead them to the decision that you're trying to make. Hopefully that helps. Consultancies, they can give you a broad depth of it, but working within a particular company, that will give you the subject matter expertise for that particular company. I started out working in manufacturing and healthcare a long time ago. Then I moved over to retail and financial services. There were some similarities. Then I moved to consumer packaged goods, which had a lot of similarities to manufacturing, but it had also a lot of similarities with retail. So layer upon layer, you learn those businesses. Another good thing about being in a consultancy is that you can bounce from industry to industry, depending on the assignment. Hopefully that helps you out. Hopefully you're not too junior that you can't go bounce into another industry if you're looking for that experience.
They said, much appreciated. A detailed response, John. Hope I can catch you on LinkedIn to get specific guidance. John is also a career coach. We do career coaching. I was very excited about that because I think John would be a great career coach for you in AJ. John, his background specifically is in data architecture. Actually, now that you've answered the question, yes, it is a completely logical starting place.
Data governance provides you a good broad perspective across an enterprise and offers consulting opportunities as well, because a lot of companies will hire in data governance practitioners instead of having them on their staff to start. The most interesting or challenging industries for data governance professionals. That would be a great blog post. Good topic for a blog post, Nicole.
Yeah.
Top 3. They all have their own unique challenges. It depends on how big the company is, if they're global or just national, or if they're regional, as to what challenges would be presented for data governance. The data governance foundations are going to be pretty much the same for just about anybody. It's just how much are they going to have as far as resources to go and enable some of those data governance, best pharmaceutical and banking.
Hey, John, I'll jump in. I'd say that the number one challenge would be change management. I'd argue that the culture and the change management when it comes to being a governance professional is probably going to be your number one challenge.
Perfect, Grant. I see some of the industries are mentioning, the more regulated the industry, the more challenging it is. However, I would almost flip that. The more
Yeah.
regulated the industry, the easier it is to understand what you need to comply with. So the policies have already been written. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad, maybe they're too heavy, like financial services is a heavily regulated industry. The challenges are maybe a little less because the culture is already ingrained around being regulated. But healthcare, it also has its own regulations. Healthcare has a little bit more leeway, so it could provide more challenge. Nobody regulates justice. So that's already a government function. So heavily regulated by itself, its nature. That's awesome.
I've heard Peter Aiken say that there is typically a 4-to-1 ratio in terms of the amount of emphasis that needs to be put on the people, process, and cultural aspects of a data management initiative compared to the 20% that is placed, the emphasis is on the technology itself. So probably more challenging if you don't have the buy-in and the regulatory framework, et cetera, already in place. So it could be more difficult if there's actually less emphasis on data management.
So very good. I love the questions.
Great questions. Do you have recommendations for someone who is new?
Oh, well, I do find that there are quite a few newsletters that you can pick up off of LinkedIn. A couple of the ones here in the Atlanta area that I follow is Tech in Motion. They usually have some pretty good events and newsletters that come out just following current trends. And I just recently signed up for a new AI newsletter.
Yeah, I like One Useful Thing for AI News. Ethan Mollick. He's very hands-on, practical, really, really good.
I'm sorry, Nicole,
Oh,
if
yeah.
you don't mind. I do have a
Don't mind.
article to share. So this guy, he has a Substack. I don't know if you saw Dylan Anderson. He's very active on LinkedIn too. He has free Substack articles titled The Data Ecosystem. So this article has a good summary of a lot of the same concepts that was mentioned in from the framework perspective, aligning business strategy with the data lifecycle. He goes through step by step, and his Substack chapters go through each one of these different boxes as well. If you're new, it's a really good read for you to get started and get familiar with the concepts in a short fashion.
This is awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
I think we'll just catch you all next month if you're going to join us next month.
Cool. Thank you
Have
so
a
much,
great weekend.
John. Really appreciate it. And thank you to Dennis, Grant, and Aliana, all of our teammates, for their help in the chat. It's been great. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.